So in this section of the course, we're going to be talking about storage accounts, specifically how to create them, how to manage them, and some of the technical details around them. Now, a storage account is one of those fundamental pieces of cloud technology. I consider it one of those three basic cloud services along with virtual machines and virtual networks. Storage can be used for two purposes. One is for you to actually store files, just as you do on a hard disk. So it becomes where you put your backup files, where you put your database files. You can put your JPEGs and your videos, store them in a storage account. The other is as the backend to a virtual machine. So actually there's a lot of services within Azure that need a storage account, sometimes for logging and sometimes as a fundamental piece of the technology. So a virtual machine needs a storage account. You can't create a virtual machine without one. And when you're creating a virtual machine, you'll be creating a storage account at the same time. It's part of that wizard interface. So in this video, we're going to talk about the non-virtual machine type of storage account, which is just a general storage account. The way that you get to it, you can either be on the home page of the portal, you can have a dashboard. In any event, you're going to have this create a resource button. You can also go and view all of your storage accounts and be able to create storage accounts from that view. So I'm just going to click this create a resource button. Storage account is right on the get started list of resources, the last one. You can also go into the category of storage and it's the first one. And I'm just going to click on that. Now we're taken into this wizard view. There's 5 tabs on the wizard. First one is for basics, then networking, advanced, tagging, and review. So this is a pretty standard Azure portal creation screen. First thing we have to do is decide which subscription this belongs in. You may only have one. I only have one in this tenant. And so you can choose your subscription here. It needs to be put into a resource group. Now you either already have one or you're going to create one. I'm going to create one and I'm going to call it AZ104RG. Now a storage account needs a name and that name needs to be unique across all of Azure. And so if you just choose a generic name like storage, that's generally going to be taken because out of the millions of Azure users, someone has a storage account named storage. So generally I use my initials. Give it a name that makes sense to you for whatever application or purpose. This is going to be the basis of the URL that you're going to use for any programmatic access, the REST API or the SDK. Now, the next big decision is the location. Now, location does matter for a couple of reasons. One is you generally want your storage account to be as close as possible to the application or the users using that storage account. So if this storage account is going to be the back end for your website, well, then you want whatever's running your website to be in the same region as the storage account because you're going to end up having communication lags and latency introduced if you're going to push this storage account into a different region. The other implication of the region is the cost. So believe it or not, it actually does cost different to put storage accounts in different regions. So if you put it in East US, you're paying one price per gigabyte. But if you put it in Australia, it's going to be different. Southeast Asia is different. South America different, etc. I'm going to put this in Canada. But again, the decision is going to be kind of based on your own circumstances. The next decision you make is around performance. Now, the term performance is pretty straightforward. If you choose the premium level of performance for storage accounts, you are basically choosing what's called SSD, which is the solid state disk, the flash disk. For performance, it's a lot quicker to read and write to a flash disk, but there are capacity differences and pricing differences. Okay, so choosing premium is going to basically lock me into this solid state form. If I choose standard, then it's the magnetic disk. Notice also when I go from standard to premium, one of the selections goes away, which is the access tier. We'll talk about that in a second. So I'm going to leave it on the standard. You really, only if performance of that hard drive is of most importance would you go to the premium. So what kind of account do we want? Now, generally for 99.5% of uses, general purpose V2 is the storage account kind. It's very flexible. It has all the latest features. General purpose V1 is an old version, as it's clear here, and Microsoft is not adding any new features. It doesn't have some of the more recent features. The only reason you choose general purpose V1 is if you have compatibility to existing general purpose V1 accounts that you need like another V1 account. But that's even become more rare. Like this has been out for so many years now that you should be looking to move to general purpose V2. Finally, the blob storage is also kind of a niche storage account type For blob storage, you lose some, you can't have tables or queues or files or any other kind of storage. It's only blob storage. And you can have public containers and public files and no access codes required. Again, a very niche use for storage account. So general purpose V2 is what you're going to choose 99.5% of the time. Now, replication is kind of complicated to explain. I'm going to do my best here, but there are, as you can see, I chose Canada Central. I'm only given 3 options in terms of replication: locally redundant storage, geo-redundant storage, and read access. Locally redundant storage will keep up to 3 copies of my files in the same data center. So you can see them, stored on different hard disks. And so if one of those hard disks was to fail, Azure would be able to recreate the file because it's got 2 other copies in the same data center. There's another one called zone redundant storage, which distributes across multiple data centers in the same region. Geo-redundant storage stores 6 copies of your file across 2 data centers. And this is if a region was to go down. Let's say Canada Central suffered a power outage, an internet outage, and it was going to be down for a couple hours. Having geo-redundant storage would save my bacon because the file would still be available elsewhere. But locally redundant storage means I have to wait for the region to come back. Finally, the read access version allows you to have a readable URL, a secondary URL that you can read your file. And so you can then split the writing to the primary location and the reading to the global location. And that's a performance hack for frequently accessed files. Now, if I was to change this to back to like East US and go back down to replication, you'll see a lot more choices. So the zone redundant storage, which is the file is stored across multiple data centers in the same region. And now we've got a couple of preview modes for geo zone redundant storage and geo zone redundant storage read access. Now, good news is preview features are not generally tested on the exam. So we don't really need to know, but this has more to do with availability zones, which is something that's unique to this East US region that's not yet available in Canada Central and maybe will be available at some point in the future. All right. And finally, the access tier. There are 2 types of access tiers that you can set by default. One is hot, one is cool. Hot is the default. And basically it means that you're going to be charged a certain amount for the storage and you're charged a certain amount for accessing those files. So you're basically the charges for a storage account are across those 2 accesses. The cool tier saves you money. It's half the price for storage, but it's twice the price for access. So you're basically, this is great for backup files, for zip files, for historical files. You're saving money on the storage for files you don't often access. So you must consider whether you should set hot by default or cool by default. Now, there is such a thing as a storage lifecycle. We'll talk about that in a moment. And there's another access tier called archive tier. So you can actually put things into a cold storage. So you can do this programmatically on a file-by-file basis, or you can set this as a default for the entire storage account. When we come back, we're going to talk about the networking tab.